Welcome to the panel, An Afro Museum Under Construction. To all the participants in this panel, I would like you to share your questions and impressions in this chat of the Zoom, which will be read as the conversation progresses. Also, we'd like you to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras during the event in order to have a more fluid, connection. So we can have a great panel today. The objective of this panel today is to share experiences, learnings, even lessons on the challenging task of imagining, planning, and building a museum for a highly diverse African-American communities in the case of the United States of America, and how these learnings can be put to good use by our current project, the Afro-Colombian Museum. We just would like to understand how these magnificent and beautiful museums that you have in the United States regarding the African-American history can express something to our project, and we can learn some from these experiences that we consider are perhaps the most profound and interesting experiences creating museums regarding the Afro cultures. So to begin with this panel, I would like our team from the National Museum of Colombia to play the following video, specially made for this panel by the current Minister of Culture of Colombia, 𝗘𝘀𝘁𝗨𝗂𝗶𝗀.
Quiero darles un saludo muy especial a los panelistas y a todas las personas que se conectan hoy a este diálogo que llamamos un Museo Afro en Construcción, aprendizajes compartidos por museos de Estados Unidos. Adicionalmente, quiero enviar un saludo especial al embajador de Estados Unidos en Colombia, 𝗘𝘀𝘀𝘁, manifestar que hemos trabajado de manera muy articulada con él en Colombia por la protección del patrimonio. Su compromiso con la cultura de nuestro país ha permitido el desarrollo de maravillosas iniciativas que celebramos y reconocemos. Ya son 200 años de relaciones fructíferas entre ambos países y sabemos que serán muchos más donde la cultura será fundamental en esta relación. La idea de crear un museo afro en Colombia nace de las entrañas de las comunidades negras afrocolombianas raizales y se formula desde el reconocimiento a su historia, sus luchas, resiliencia, pero sobre todo a la contribución significativa que han hecho al desarrollo de nuestra nación. A través del desarrollo del Museo Afro, buscamos seguir reconociendo la importancia de la diversidad cultural de nuestro país, mostrar cómo a partir de la historia esa diversidad étnica y cultural ha permitido que nos convirtamos en una nación diversa, donde los aportes que cada una de las comunidades han sido significativos para el desarrollo de nuestro concepto. Adicionalmente, el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo establece que la creación del Museo Afro de Colombia sería un proyecto prioritario y que el apoyo técnico del Museo Nacional de Colombia desde el Ministerio de Cultura estamos trabajando de manera ardua para convertir este sueño en una realidad. Su desarrollo institucional hasta el conceptual ha sido abordado de manera inclusiva desde los territorios, trabajando con las comunidades afrocolombianas todo el proceso de museología y conceptualización de este gran proyecto. Consideramos que este panel de expertos hace parte de los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo para sumar experiencias, voces, memoria, conocimientos históricos a través de la reflexión y la construcción. Por tal motivo, hoy los invitamos a que nos acompañen a pensar, crear y colaborar en este proceso participativo. Queremos que se apropien de este museo, que se unan a este gran esfuerzo de construcción colectiva y que lo nutran con sus experiencias. El Museo Afro es sin duda un gran mensaje de inclusión para nuestro país. Invito a todos ustedes a que nos ayuden a construir este sueño y agradezco a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en Colombia por propiciar este espacio, por ayudarnos a que hiciera parte del mes de la conmemoración de la historia negra y se refuercen estos 200 años de relaciones bilaterales entre Colombia y Estados Unidos, donde el reconocimiento de la diversidad racial ha sido uno de los grandes temas de las últimas décadas.
La cultura es de todos. Ministerio de Cultura.
Thank you to the Minister of Culture. And now I would like to introduce Caroline Turpin, the U.S. Embassy Cultural Attaché in Bogotá.
¿Me escuchan bien?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here as part of this virtual panel on Afro-Colombian Museum in Construction, sponsored by the National Museum, the Embassy of the United States in Bogotá, and the Arts Envoy program of the U.S. State Department. I would like to extend very special regards to the Minister of Culture, Angélica Mayolo, Juliana Restrepo, the director of the National Museum, and the team and the staff of the new Afro-Colombian Museum, and the members of our panel, Dr. 𝗘𝘀𝘁 the head of programs and exhibitions for the Human and Civil Rights Center, Dr. Neil Barkley, the director of the Charles H. Wright Afro-American Museum, and Dr. Donda Lee, the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs, the Washington Culture and Afro-American Culture Museum. In our conversations with the Ministry of Culture during the last years, we have received with great expectation the news of the project of the museum going forward, and we wanted to organize this panel in order to reiterate our support. We hope that this will allow us to share experiences and learnings that will contribute to the construction of the new Afro-Colombian Museum. This panel is also part of our 2022 in our celebration of 200 years of bilateral relations between Colombia and the U.S. During our friendship, culture has always been a space that has allowed us to share our identities, our diversity, and that has allowed us to strengthen our bonds from art to hip-hop, from conceptual art to muralism. We have shared with Colombian people our most genuine manifestations, and we hope to open new windows of exchange for many years to come. Thank you for supporting us and for joining us in this year of celebration, for offering us your friendship, and for sharing this very interesting discussion with us. Welcome once again, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turpin. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists for this event today. And we have a great panel in regarding this subject. We have, as Ms. Turpin mentioned, Dr. Neil Barkley, the Executive Director at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. I believe it's located in Detroit, isn't it? Yeah, Detroit, great city to talk about. And we have Dr. 𝗘𝘀𝘁, the Programs and Exhibition Director at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights from Atlanta, Georgia. And finally, we have Dr. Gwendolyn Reese, the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Smithsonian Museum, which is located at the mall in Washington, D.C. So I'd like you to introduce yourselves, very short, but make it interesting, please. Maybe with Mr. Barkley, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking to all of you today, albeit virtually. As was mentioned, my name is Neil Barkley, and I have the great privilege of being the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Charles H. Wright Museum in Detroit, Michigan. Our museum, now some 50 plus years old, was one of the first encyclopedic museums of African American history in the country. And we are pleased to be continuing to grow and develop our museum, not just as a repository of history, but also of art and culture. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berkeley. And now we're giving the word to Dr. Lee.
Thank you for having me this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here. I am joining you from Atlanta, Georgia, where I am actually the head of interpretation at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And what that means to be the head of interpretation here is that exhibitions, education, and many of the programs all fall under my purview. So those are the teams that I lead. And this is a fairly new institution. It's a very new institution, actually, founded in or opened in 2014. So we are still in our, I would say, toddlerhood. And we are undergoing a process right now of expansion. So I think we have some interesting things maybe to talk about in terms of what it looks like to build an institution. Even still, although we are open to the public, we are going to be expanding the institution by more than a third within the next few years. So very much still trying to actualize the full mission of the institution. And our institution right now covers a period from what I like to call the short civil rights movement, so maybe the mid-1940s to present. We will be going back further, and we also will be having greater conversations and in multiple disciplines to think about why this history has relevance to communities today and the issues that they're struggling with. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. And now I'll pass the word to Dr. Ries for her introduction.
Good afternoon. I'm great to be here with everyone, and I'm honored to be able to share our experiences with you as you move forward in building this museum. As I was introduced, I am Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I have been at the Smithsonian for 13 years. I have just recently, I started at our museum as the curator of music and performing arts, and just recently someone took over that position. But my background really comes from music and theater, using the arts in museums, and also doing a lot of community-based projects, either exhibitions. So all of that really fed into my experience here at the museum. And hopefully some of you are aware, we've been open for 5 years, have exhibits. We're a mixture of history and culture, and also art. So we really get to engage with the African American experience from a multidisciplinary lens. And I know my approach, at least working with culture, is that the history is just as embedded in the culture itself. And that's the kind of approach that I have taken throughout my career, and that you would see in our exhibitions and programs here at the museum.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ries. I'd like to all the guests and participants in this panel to share your questions and impressions in this chat of Zoom, which will be read as the conversation progresses. And also, I would like you to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras during the event. Now we're going to begin with, we have for today 3 topics. I believe they are very, very relevant. As you already said, we're talking about museums as not institutions for being just a repository for history. Museums are relevant institutions, museums that are community-based projects. And I'd like to begin with this reflection. We in Colombia have identified several challenging tensions in the process of building this community. We have identified that there are some tensions between a national initiative, because we are trying to come up with this national museum, and we have identified some tensions with communities, with community initiatives, and even their own museum projects. So we would like to begin with that, maybe with this topic, talking about how do you manage in the United States to find this perfect balance, or well, maybe not perfect, but this balance between a national initiative and the community interests and their community institution interests.
Did you want anyone to jump in, Juli?
I can start. Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a particular issue with this museum. It took over 100 years to get this built, but in that time, there was a movement in the 60s that really was the African American Museum movement. So there were people throughout the country who had been collecting this history and sharing this history, building museums, some with national scope, some with a regional scope, but having a place so that history can be preserved and shared with people. And this institution is built on the shoulders of those who created those institutions. So when legislation was passed and we knew we were going to have a national museum, I think particularly national versus regional, there's always a tension, particularly if it's a government and it just has a big presence. And I think some of that is natural. You know, if you're the big presence in the room, there may be a fear that you're going to take all the objects or you're going to do this. And I think it was very clear from the very beginning, our founding director, Lonnie Bunch, really positioned the museum in a way so that the community was just as invested in it as the people at the Smithsonian or the government or the staff, and that there's a shared ownership in this particular organization. And part of that comes from really listening to people and really bringing them in. I think you have to develop a level of trust. And trust for me, and I've learned this throughout my career, is not just doing a project, ending it and moving on. Trust is a long-term relationship. And you have to do everything you can to support that trust. There's some things you're limited to by just by being an institution, but I think trust comes from, you know, who's on your staff. Trust absolutely comes from how you tell your stories. A good thing with culture, are you going to just tell, you know, the performance and what's great about the culture? Or are you going to deal with some of the difficult histories that these cultural traditions were born in? And I think one of the things we did as a museum, or we constantly say to ourselves, we're going to tell the unvarnished truth. You know, there's celebration, there's joy, there's cultural output, but there's also a history there. And I think any community-based project has to honor that and demonstrate ways that you do honor that. And I would just add, you know, one of the things we saw ourselves not in competition, but in partnership. So everything, about this museum, and I think about the museums that have informed this museum, is that this is a project that we do together because it's all of our history. And I'll just stop there.
I'd love to build on that, Dr. Reese, because as you were perhaps one of the last African-American museums to be created, we were the first, or among the first, with the 𝗔𝗽𝗿𝗀𝗀. So some 50-something years ago, the Charles H. Wright Museum was founded in Detroit out of the civil rights movement, by and large. So what our community really was trying to address at that point. The rebellions that happened in Detroit in '67 led to a more intense focus on trying to build a center of national reach and significance in Detroit. What's interesting about how we look at ourselves some 50 years later is really mining the history of Detroit, which of course is known just not only for its role in the civil rights movement, but its role in contemporary music, sport, a number of different aspects of African-American life. And using Detroit as a place where we can tell national stories, to look at trends and things that have happened here within the context of things that have happened in communities around the world, frankly. And so we have the sort of, we've been able to address both this local community-based focus with a national focus by really making our own city the petri dish, if you will, for those conversations, for those, the things that we do here. And that's been fairly successful for us. There is always, I think, within an African-American community, some tension between what people really mean when they say community and what we're actually talking about in terms of engaging a wide range of stakeholders, right? Because there is, this impetus of wanting everything to be specifically about a certain aspect of African-American life, whether it be a nationalist point of view, whether it be a highly political point of view. These things exist in our community. And I think embracing them all, as you suggest, and talking about sort of the difficult stories behind some of the patina of our culture is where it really gets interesting, doesn't it? And where we really can begin to delve into ideas, concepts, the complexity of what it has meant to be African Americans, historically and even in the present day. And I'll leave it there.
I have to say that I haven't found a single thing that I disagree with about what either of my compatriots have to say. But I'd like to build on a few things. I think one thing that occurs to me is that we are always, when we're having this conversation about a regional or a national conversation, when we're having this conversation about stakeholdership, I think we're having a conversation often about who is our audience and what we're centering. So when we talk about Afro-American experience, and I would imagine to some extent when we talk about Afro-Colombian as well, we are often thinking about a subject, right? The topics, the subject, what is it that is our story? But I would like to say also that I think we're talking about who that story is for. So it is not only about what the content is, but about who is narrating that story and for whose interest and benefit. We can sometimes, for example, be very interested in sharing our stories, our history for an other audience, right? For an external gaze. We were here too, we belong here too. Our voices have been for too long ignored. But there's also something that's very important about saying, these are the things that we need to know and share about ourselves. These are the assertions that we're trying to make about our belonging and about our entitlements. And I think that that's something to really delve into and to think about how you are balancing those things when you are building. And I think that sometimes it has a regional versus national aspect to that conversation as well. What we do at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights is that we focus primarily on a national story, but we have a section that is focused specifically around Atlanta as what we like to call the brain trust for the civil rights movement. So there's an interesting thing for the few of you maybe who are on this Zoom who know something about Southern US history. People, when asked whether Atlanta is important for the civil rights movement, almost universally say, yes, of course. And I love to ask them why. What happened here? And they always look stunned, because even among people who are scholars, very often they can't think of anything, or they'll say, well, Dr. King was from Atlanta. But when you think about the seminal events of the civil rights movement, when you think about the bus boycotts, when you think about the marches, they didn't happen in Atlanta. And they really didn't happen in Atlanta by design. They were planned in Atlanta, and there are reasons for that. And so what we like to do, and what we're planning to do during the expansion, is to help people to understand how the regional history has national significance and how the regional history was actually pivotal in creating a national story, and then delving in more specifically when we get the chance. And part of the way that we delve in, and this is kind of my third point about thinking through your question, Julian, is that though we are having a conversation about museums and how important these institutions are and how committed we are to building and growing them, I would say to you that a huge part of what's important about a museum is not about what happens inside of that building. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, for us, one of the areas under my purview is education. And I feel strongly that the educational work that the museum does with primary and secondary schools is at least as important, and probably more important, than what happens inside the museum for people who are touring and visiting. So it is that the museum is a launch pad, if you will, for being able to share from a curricular perspective and even a co-curricular perspective, these stories that are far too often left out of the syllabi that are constructed by local school boards, and then at a more granular level by schools themselves. That has been a huge part of what has actually made our work national, because a lot of schools that rely on us for curricular and co-curricular work and help, and particularly now with COVID and having gone so much into the virtual space and being able, therefore, to reach out to schools in California or schools in Michigan and such, that's a really important part of what we do too. So it's not just about what happens inside of our institution. And then finally, I would just say that, you know, the community is not a singular thing. And we only tend to think about it that way when we're thinking about the community versus our institution. But once you get into the community, there are at least as many opinions and needs and assertions as there are constituencies in the community. And I think that for us, part of what we're still trying to become better at is exactly what Dr. Reese was talking about, which is about listening and consolidating trust and being flexible and nimble and knowing that what communities are telling you they need now, you may respond to in a particular way, but you need to build in a way that will be flexible so that you can respond to those things or many other things in the future in different ways.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And I would say that you place one very important topic, and is the idea of territory around the museum. I believe we can agree that a museum in the 21st century is about audiences, is about the visitor, is about communities, is about this territory that is surrounding the museum. But when we came up with this idea of making an Afro-Colombian museum, it started, let's say, 4 years ago. And it's like an idea that stems from the Afro-Colombian communities. So we start building this idea. And the first, criticism that we got is that we're gonna build something that is perhaps very centralized, therefore very polemic, because people sometimes doesn't feel so engaged in the idea of museums. Museums tend to be seen in Colombia sometimes by the academics as, hegemonic institutions, very narrow-minded sometimes, with just one way of telling one history. So that's very, for me personally, I would say it's very difficult to develop this level of trust and to create a long-term relationship when you cannot change this idea that museums are not anymore a 19th century institution, but there are a 21st century institution. What would you say about that? Do you think is there any similar problem in the United States with people thinking that museums are hegemonic and are very, boring and narrow-minded and perhaps dangerous for memories of communities?
Yes and no.
Yes,
but I would think the emerging concept of museums, at least in the States, is changing. Is changing quite a deal, that museums are now seeing themselves, not necessarily as the hierarchy, but active, engaged citizens of a community. And in certain areas across the nation, they've really taken a hold that communities, flock to these places, have partnerships, and do all kinds of things. Now, some of those other issues, yes, they still exist. That there's certain communities who don't feel at home in the museum. I think the National Museum of African American History and Culture is different in that way than some of the other institutions at the Smithsonian that have been around for a long time, that it opened those doors. So to me, it's really practicing what you preach in everything you do, that you really be strategic, whether you're developing programs that represent a diverse point of view or diverse regions. You've got to demonstrate that you have that kind of respect for the entire history. And I think that is the key to opening doors. It is a process. And I think you're well positioned if you understand that and do the kinds of things that let people get to know you and the possibility, and also be committed to being an actively engaged citizen. Also, national versus small nonprofit, yeah, there are some tensions there. I mean, you will experience some of that, but people need to know that their institutions are authentic and committed. They may make mistakes, but they're going to listen.
Yeah, I would agree that the concept of museums, certainly in the States, has changed pretty radically, actually, in the past decade, I would even say, to where this notion of being, as Dr. Reese puts it, a community partner, community engaged citizen, is really part of the role of the institution in our communities throughout the country. I can say in Detroit that the right is almost like a church, right? In the sense that people see it as the gathering place for anything significant that happens to the African American community, and that it happens to our community. We're the last viewing place for Aretha Franklin and Rosa Parks. They lied and stayed in the center of our rotunda. right, for days as before they were, laid to rest. And so it's that significance that people see the right as in our community. But that does come with, making sure that we, deserve that place in the community, and making sure that we are active in including as many different kinds of stakeholders as we can in the work that we do. And, we have not always been successful with that. We've made some missteps in that regard, but I think, being honest and true about those missteps, learning from them, listening, and moving on is what makes for the engagement that we can have and enjoy with our communities. I also want to just echo this notion of education being so important. I live in a community where literacy, literally, is a huge problem within the African American community. We don't have a large part of our community that even reads well, right? And we're not just talking about children, we're talking about adults as well, right? And so this notion of being a place where people can feel comfortable about learning things about themselves and about their culture within the context of not maybe being able to read and understand a lot of what they hear elsewhere is an important part of the role that we play here. And so, there are a number of different ways of getting at this notion of being both a local treasure and a national one, but those are some of the ways that your question just makes me think about that we've tried here.
Yeah, I think, I would agree that the notion of the museum as, some distant house on a hill is changing. Certainly the ideal is changing, right? So the idea that this is what we aspire to has changed. I think, within our own institutions and across the industry at large, we have varying degrees of success with being that approachable space. And also maybe, I think part of what Dr. Barclay is talking about is also being a town hall kind of space. So it's not just about the welcoming of folks into the museum, but also the idea that the museum itself stands for more than this traditional notion of a space of display and even interpretation more broadly written display. I agree. I think that multiple stakeholders, engaging multiple stakeholders is really important. I think one of the things that we are certainly, I was going to say challenged by, so I'm going to just cop to that. I was going to say challenged by that we have an opportunity that we need to lean in further is what that means is not necessarily outreach. So it is not necessarily just this idea that we create something and then we invite lots and lots of different people in, but rather that we are sharing authority in the process of creating. Because if you want people to be fully bought in and you want people to feel like they're really represented, then give them a voice and a stake in what you are actually creating while you're creating it. And that isn't something that we've always done, but I think that it also challenges our notion of where knowledge is produced from, right? That knowledge isn't just produced by us, the experts, who then, try to make it accessible as we then, kind of share it with others, but that also there is knowledge within our communities that we need to mine and render accessible and visible in all kinds of different ways. People love to see themselves, their voice, their interpretation, literally themselves in all sorts of spaces. We certainly know this in our...
I'd like to chime in on that. I agree with you, absolutely. I think where it gets challenging is we're talking about museums and how they change, but when it really comes to the end of it, we're still institutions. And just the way that an institution connects with a community, what does co-authorship really mean? And that is something, in my career and just looking at the projects, it's not, if you really wanted to do clear 50-50, institutions kind of have to give up a little because there's some areas where the balance is a little tipped. And I'd love to see what that really looks like. I mean, money is power. I mean, who holds, I mean, if you're really sorry to break it apart, but that's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And in fact, I have a project right now. So I was going to say a couple of other things, but I want to put a pin in just really quickly because I have a project right now that might be an interesting little case study in that regard. But I did also just want to say that I wanted to also remind our colleagues that there are also other sorts of really practical prohibitions around the democratization, if you will, of museum spaces. And even things as simple as the cost of admission, right? Like, you know, Dr. Reese, you're at the Smithsonian, where it is actually free for folks to walk in the door. I'm in an institution where it costs $21.50. So that means that a family of 4, by the time they come in and maybe has something very modest to eat, has spent over $100. And so what it means to build an institution and build in a framework where it's even basically minimally accessible is also something that I think is really important to think about from the beginning. But I want to run back really quickly to this point that you were making about working together. We were asked almost a year ago now to join a project to create a memorial in what is now Atlanta's largest city park around a history of convict leasing. So it was meant to share research, memorialize and commemorate convict leasing. And for those who don't know, the quick understanding of this is that at the turn of the 19th century and, you know, for actually several decades beyond, after African Americans were 4.5 million African Americans were emancipated from enslavement, and the South faced a particular labor shortage, right, of uncompensated labor. One of the things that happened, and this is, I'm oversimplifying, so forgive me a little bit, but one of the things that happened was that tens of thousands, at least, well documented, tens of thousands of people were incarcerated for crimes, you know, as minimal as, say, vagrancy. So if you don't agree basically to work for any wage, then you're a vagrant, and then you can be incarcerated, and then you can be forced into labor as part of the punishment for your crime. So this happened throughout actually the nation, not just the South, but particularly in the American South. And in the Atlanta area, there are a number of sites that were actually prison farms and where there were well-documented atrocities committed against people who were incarcerated in those spaces. I mean, all the way down to people being starved to death, flogged, you know, whipped, all kinds of terrible things. And so we were trying to create a memorial to that. And it's a painful, fraught, not well documented in some spaces, history that is also really contemporarily relevant as we talk about issues like mass incarceration. And so we started working on it, and I realized very early on, to your point, Dr. Reese, that we needed to have a multi-stakeholder engagement from the beginning. And so what that looks like in terms of planning what this is going to be, the form that memorialization is taking, the questions that need to be answered, all of those things, the research around it, is that we're working with institutions of higher education. That's not so unusual. We're working with other nonprofit organizations, cultural organizations. That's a little unusual. We're working with school systems, including the school board. We're working with funders as partners in this planning process. We're working with direct service organizations, and we're even working with organizations like the Descendants Coalition of people who were incarcerated in this space. It is slow going. It is painstaking, but the outputs have been really interesting and useful already and programmatic, and have really gathered much more attention. And we've been able to educate people through this process of having these meetings, which become public programs, and have been able to, I think, garner interest in engagement in a way that is actually usually harder to do when we're going it alone.
This sentence from Dr. Ruiz caught me caught my eye. I don't know how to say that in English, sorry. You said institutions are going to listen after mistakes or something like that. I'm paraphrasing that, no? After we made mistakes, we're gonna listen and maybe change things. And we're doing this project with this methodology, which is called prototyping, to test some ideas, some intentions, some even subjects of the structure of the museum. And we have noticed that there's a huge resistance on the idea of, I call it centralized diversity. And I'm talking about the challenges of concentrating many memories, many heritage, and many collections in one place. And I would like to ask all of you, not just Dr. Ruiz from the Smithsonian, because I mean that's a national museum, and the others I believe are more from a particular place. What can be the point of establishing a great museum in one place? What's this idea? Is this idea a 19th century idea? Are we Colombians trying to create a 19th century idea of a museum, or is it relevant to think of a great museum in the 21st century located in just one place, concentrating a lot of memories, a lot of heritage, and probably a lot of objects? What will you believe will be the message behind that? Should it be possible to think of a museum in that nature, a little bit centralized, and how can we tackle to destroy the idea that we're gonna be like another colonial project, centralizing, exfoliating, and taking objects from all over this country and putting these objects in just one place, the National Afro-Colombian Museum? What would you say will be your thoughts about that?
You talked about it. It's the way you initially talk about it to people outside or exterior, is that you're a place, you have a mandate, it's national, but you're not the place. I had never heard, that's why I was sitting here, I never heard about centralizing diversity. And I started to think about that, and it kind of ties into some comments I wanted to share about content. And, you know, just as was mentioned before, there's no one African American community. And one of the things in the storytelling we did through our programs and through our exhibitions was to make it clear that there is no one experience. There is no one point of view. There is no one of everything. And so what is local, what is regional, is indeed national. Now, of course, in a museum, you only have a limited amount of space for collections and stories, but I think if you open that up to visitors so that they can see that, they get that sense. And the other caveat, and I don't know if this has come up, but I do know, you know, once we open, you know, there are a lot of expectations, and as scholarship and the narratives have changed throughout society, you know, there are other things besides culture. There are gender and sexual identities. Class is a big issue. Museums are inherently kind of a middle class thing. You know, we have to be really cognizant of some of those things. We had discussions when we were building the museum, you know, women. I mean, the history about women is what's available is very different than it was men. And so you think about the sources you have and the narratives that we live through, gaps. Those are real gaps, and those are things that will carry forth into the community as well. So there is a lot of strategy, but a lot of careful thinking. It's just amazing how little of a thing can make such a big difference of how you're perceived. by your potential audiences?
You know, I do think the notion of being national does not necessarily mean that you have something there for everyone, but that you recognize that within the national community, there are numerous voices that address specifically different communities. And though that is part of maybe the story that you need to tell from a national lens, that this is a place for everyone. These are the things that we have, but there are these other places within our community that also have deep resources that we embrace, that we celebrate, and that we make sure that a light is shone upon, right? And that can be the role of a national, not to have everything, but to know where everything is, right? And to simply shine a light on those places where there is a deeper engagement with a certain subject or a certain stakeholder, et cetera, and make that part of the work that you do, right? So it's not that you have everything, but that you have a way of talking about the whole that is not necessarily centered just on what you have and what you hold.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say, you know, I'm going to use an example that's actually from one of these other organizations. One of the things that I most admired about what the National Museum, when the MOC did when it was, you know, not even built yet, was to go into communities and help people understand what they had and the value of what they had and ways to preserve what they had and not be acquisitive. So in every instance, it wasn't about taking something and holding it or hoarding it in this really kind of post-colonial museum and colonial and post-colonial museum kind of context, but to say, this is what it means to safeguard your own treasures. And we're going to help you do that. The museum where I work right now, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, is not a collecting institution. And to the extent that we have nonetheless collected two or have two collections, I'm actually trying to offload them and have been working with an archive to do that because we are not the best place for them, because we are not we don't have the resources, the sufficient resources to make them available to researchers and others. And what's not on display doesn't get used, doesn't get to be seen, doesn't get to be explored. And so I think that there are also other ways of thinking about museums in the 21st century that aren't even about holding collections. In our expansion, we have a whole section that's called Activation Lab, which is really a place about saying to folks, so what are you going to do with what you learned here? How does what you've learned about the past apply to the problems that you're trying to solve contemporarily? I don't know how that's going to work out. It's an interesting idea, but I think it's really important to just explode, even as we're talking about what the negative things that museums can be, to explode those constraints in our own minds.
Thank you for mentioning that program, because that is one thing as a national museum that we have continued to do, is that, you know, once again, as a national museum, you are not the only presence and you're not the only one who can tell everyone's story. In fact, you won't be able to. But what you have skills, knowledge, expertise that while you're telling the story, you're going to help that other museum down the road or whatever. I've never been to Colombia, but whatever that might be, create its own museum for its community. And so it's a shared sense of identity and sense of purpose. We have the Treasures program. We have what we call the Smith Center. We go out in the communities and digitize home movies, photographs. We work with individuals. We also work with other collecting institutions, primarily Black collecting institutions that have that culture. So it's not just about the national, it's supporting and taking this expertise. And that is part of the spirit of the African American Museum movement. Rising tide lifts all boats. And that is really part of our profile, an active internship program, training, professional development. That is part of what we do.
Yeah, I believe when you say that you work with communities to understand the value of what they have is perhaps one of the most important topics for us in this project. And talking about the value of what they had, I would like to talk about the contribution of a museum in a city with deep political, economic, and social crisis, such as perhaps Detroit. I understand Detroit has been in a difficult situation for the past, let's say, 40 or 50 years. And we have this city in Colombia, which is Cali, where the museum is going to be built, that has seen the major, perhaps the major amount, the biggest amount of protests the past year because of a social and economic turmoil. So I would like to know or to hear about your experiences of your museums working in this, digamos, let's say in this crisis. How can a museum like your museums build a new society, a place which, as you already mentioned, can be function as a town hall, a forum?
Well, I could just talk about Detroit. I mean, I think the media does Detroit a disservice. I'll just start there. By anybody who comes to Detroit, certainly in the last 5 years, I'll just say, would not recognize it from how it's described in the media. Detroit does have a long way to go in its revitalization, but I would say that it has continued to evolve and to continue to become whatever the word is, the city that really started a lot of the innovation in music and technology that it's known for around the world, right? And so I do think Detroit has a difficult economic situation in that, like many American cities, people moved out of the city core into the suburbs, leaving the city of Detroit without the resources that it required to really be that center of commerce and business and economic and cultural vitality, right? But the reality is, it's not like they left the region, they just left the city, right? So one of the wealthiest zip codes in Michigan is literally right across the line from where Detroit ends, and this city, it's called Grosse Pointe, begins, right? So some of what people think about when they think about Detroit proper doesn't really take into account the actual geography and actually what happened here. But that having been said, I think what is really important about cities dealing with, economic crisis and all of that is that its museum, and I think the right has done a fairly good job of this, has to be a voice for some of those concerns, and to a certain extent, right? Prior to the previous election, we created an exhibition called Voting Matters, and it was really about all the things that people hear about as it relates to voting, but don't quite understand. What is gerrymandering really? What are they talking about? And how did the Supreme Court come through and gut it? What did that mean? How did we have a popular vote where 7-9 million more people voted for someone, yet the other person won the election? Why is that? Just the basic concepts of our democracy. And it was really, really helpful for folks in our community to just understand the what they were going through, and also why it was so important that their voice be heard, right, in this era of turmoil. So I think there are things that we can and do to become partners in that. And in a city where, we don't have a great political power in Detroit, you know, our museum becomes one of the few places where our voice is heard and resonates throughout all aspects of African-American life, right? I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Julian. Does that helpful or not? Yes. Okay.
But I think in doing that, as Dr. Barclay says, you can lead the conversation too. Yeah. I think it's important, you know, we always say museums, sometimes a popular association, it's all about the past. That's not going to work anymore. No. You have to be engaged in what's going on in the present, not only to collect and preserve that history, but also be a source, if something comes up, that you can inform the conversation. Because you know these conversations and the feelings, it's about sound bites. And you know, with the internet and stream, it's just very, very different than it was 30, 40 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. And so you are a facilitator, you are an educator, and you're drawing upon the issues to give people a broader view of really understanding what they're talking about, or why a certain decision was made, all of those things. And you know, we've gotten in the position where people expect us to engage. So with success, it's a high bar. It's a high bar, and there's a lot going on from a variety of perspectives, and you know, expectations are high. But I think there's another way that you demonstrate what a new institution could be, whether it's national, local, or regional, and that you can be a leader in that way for other institutions, like-minded institutions, and other institutions not. You're not just a leader for one particular community, you're a leader for a whole country. And there are people of all, you know, stripes who are going to take notice in some way. We certainly have seen that.
I would say I agree wholeheartedly, and I would extend that conversation even and say that it is very often the case that we're not just asked what happened before that led to this, right? Like what the underpinnings are. As I like to say, you know, as history institutions, we are often called upon to explain how history is a context for the present. But in many instances, we are also asked to engage that around being a blueprint for the future. So, for example, you know, we are often in a space where we are asked what relevance the activism of the past has on addressing certain kinds of issues contemporarily. And I'll give you a really clear example, which I think actually resonates with Detroit. So, you know, Dr. Barclay, you and I have this interesting corollary problem, right? Atlanta is presented in the press, I think, far too often as the Mecca that it is not. And Detroit is presented as this, you know, right? Escape that is that Atlanta, you know, has topped many lists for the past 10 years as one of the most inequitable cities in the entire nation. And so there is some affluence and some wealth and some Black in particular access to political power, for example. And there's also an awful lot of really abject poverty and marginalization. And when we were doing the work, just for example, on the project that I mentioned before around convict leasing, as we started to do that, we couldn't have those meetings on the west side of Atlanta without people interrupting every single meeting to say, but what about gentrification? We're talking about how people were displaced then, but people are being displaced right this minute, right? You know, and so, and there's a demand. As Dr. Reese was saying, there's this demand, there's this expectation that you somehow address what is happening contemporarily. And I think part of what our mandate is to help provide people with the tools rather than necessarily as an institution to be an activist organization that does the work. The other thing, though, I want to share, and this might be different in Colombia, but the Alliance of American Museums has done a study many years, I don't want to say many years running, I don't know if it's annual, but it's happened more than once, where people are surveyed around their dispositions towards societal institutions, really writ large, lots of different things, schools, the legislature, et cetera, et cetera. And museums keep rising to the top of the list as institutions that people trust. Don't always love them, don't always feel like they're relevant to them, but they trust them, that they trust these institutions to share information that feels, that's trustworthy, right? That is somehow credible. And that puts an awful lot of pressure on us, potentially, but also there's a lot of opportunity in that. And so I think just being able to broach conversations in certain ways, provide forums for civil discussion of things that could be incredibly contentious, exist within that context of being an institution that's trusted.
And, the other word that comes out is safe, a safe space. You will have people coming into museums who never would have stepped foot in one, maybe even 10 years ago. And that safety, that's a whole panel in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But to have people say that really demonstrates a lot about how some of these museums are changing, are embracing a different point of view, a perspective, a way of doing their work, of telling the stories, the way of bringing people from the ground up, not after something's conceived, and the sense of shared ownership. To me, that is the most ideal position to be in, because no one loses in that situation. And when you, in the end of the day, we are just a member of the community and have the same obligations and responsibilities that a single citizen or household has.
Yeah, I fully believe that museums are a safe place, like, I don't know, town halls in the context of America, or even churches at some point of history. They were considered like safe places for societies, for communities. And I believe that museums are more or less the same. But I have this question about the thin line between a museum that understands and support activism and a museum that become activist. I'm not sure if there is a difference there, or should it be completely free for a museum to be an activist in the sense of, an activist institution?
I think when I hear that, one of the things about museums within the American context is most of us are prohibited from actively being involved in advocating for particular legislation, particular laws, particular candidates for office, et cetera. That's part of our charter. We're not able to do that. However, I do think that there is a role that we play, to Dr. Reese's point, in just getting the information out there about an issue in a balanced way. We don't need to take a point of view a lot of times to just present the facts, right? We can just say, this is how this came into being, and you decide what you think about it. I go back to voting matters, because we had people vote on, now that you know this information, what do you feel about it? Is that a good way to elect our officials, to have the electoral college? Is it a good idea to allow for gerrymandering or not? What do you think about it? But basically, we laid out the facts, right? And so there is this way, I think, of being quote activists, but we're technically prohibited from being, from anything other than perhaps the art of persuasion. We'll put it that way. Right?
And that term sometimes is put upon you because of the things that you're doing, even though they're not an act of activism.
Right.
So it's really kind of an interesting dilemma, because you just know certain things people are going to react to, even though you're dealing with facts, real objects, real stories.
Right.
So
comes with the territory a little bit, doesn't it? You know,
because we are a rights museum in certain ways. One of the ways that we articulate that is around helping people to tap their power to change the world around them.
Yeah, we have the same dilemma because we work for, of course, a governmental institution, and we have the same restrictions. But I believe that museums are a forum for different ideas, to converse ideas, to talk about political issues. And sometimes I would say that when museums are part of a government, it makes it very difficult to talk about that. No? We have to navigate in this uncertainty and trying to be, I don't like this word, neutrality, but we gotta be a little bit neutral to bring all the ideas and give citizens all these points of view. But let me change the subject a little bit, and I like to almost like to end this panel with this discussion. And it's about the ethical framework behind the acquisition of objects and collections. I think it's very important for our project to talk about that, to talk on how have your museums worked together with their communities to acquire or even create new objects for collections. Because I've heard and I've seen some I've seen some scenarios where people is talking that museums just go to their communities, they take objects, and that's it. They just exhibit objects as, you know, in a colonialist idea of a museum. And I'd like to know how, for instance, each of your museums managed to acquire such beautiful collections without having any of these ethical, problems, or maybe if you had any ethical problems, I would like to hear about them.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll jump in first because I'll be brief. I work now at an institution that is non-collecting. So I think, although we do have a couple of collections, we are in the business sort of doing interpretation work without being overly acquisitive, right? But I also want to say, having come from a place that was really rich with archival and artifactual resources, that it is an interesting dilemma, because one of the other issues within that space was that let me not say even Black American, I'm going to say that non-white experience of any sort was not well represented within the collection. And so what that means is that, you're always in this circular conversation where when you talk about the deficits of interpretation because those stories aren't told, then you get back to, well, we just don't have the collections that enable us to do that interpretive work. And then, so you kind of go round and round in that way. And part of what we began to do was to work much more collaboratively also with other institutions that were more well steeped within those communities. And so as much as it, is not what often collections managers want to do, we focused a lot not only on expanding the collections, but also on really being intentional about our loan programs and loan and borrowing materials so that they could stay attached to the communities the communities from whence they came. So that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind, instead of just always thinking that you have to go get it and bring it to your institution to live there. But I will yield to my colleagues for the remainder.
Go ahead, Dr. Reese.
I can speak for myself, and then I can also speak for my colleagues at the museum. There's nothing really transactional about acquiring objects for our collection. I know, as long as I've been doing this work, the best part of the job is meeting and building relationships with people. So I see every encounter as a relationship. Every acquisition is a relationship to our institution for a lifetime. We talk a lot about, inside the museum, about the donors, the donor stories, that the stories do not only rest with an object, but they rest with the experiences of the person who is sharing that. When I reach out to people, this is a partnership. It is never a transaction. It is a partnership because they want to share that legacy just as much as I want to. And it's back then that we all are invested in the same thing. And that is the richness and the beauty of this type of work. It's also a way to open up the sphere and identify new stories that didn't come to light in the school books or in the dominant narratives or this, and that. And to me, from kind of a grand scheme, that's the most important stuff. So it's an intention and how you conduct your work and how you assign value to that relationship so that it's just another piece of your museum. It's kind of an ethos for me of how I want to do this work and how I want it to mean something to people long term.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, like Dr. Reese, none of this is transactional for us at all. We may have a collection that we're interested in acquiring, but we develop a relationship with the donor and try to determine if the right is the right place for it. Oftentimes collections come to us, right? People want us to take something and we have to determine to what purpose, to what end would we have that collection and what would we be able to do with it. I think we are less and less focused on objects and archival material as a source for the storytelling that we do as well. We're moving into a much more technologically driven storytelling model where the objects could be borrowed and built into the story just as easily as they could be on display, right? And perhaps even more in more interesting ways, right? And so because of that, just where our field is going in terms of exhibition design, I think that the ethical considerations are those of respect and trust that you would have with any relationship, right? But beyond that, the use of the objects, why you have them, are you the best place to store them is all part and parcel of those kinds of conversations. But I'm also not that familiar with museums that are just going out taking stuff and then trying to claim that, it was some great prize. I mean, you hear that in some of the big museums that have really pillaged certain places in the world. But in general, with museums, I don't think because there's the internet and how much information is available on some of these objects, they couldn't just steal it and put it on display without a huge backlash, right? That's just the way I think about it. Maybe others have a different point of view on that, but I think it's unusual to be able to get away with that. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I still see some museums, bidding in some auctions. So yeah. There is an ethical framework.
It happens, no question. Yeah,
it happens. Yeah. So but let me talk something very, very technical. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. And have your museums done any kind of archaeological research regarding African American places of memory. And I pose this question because some of my colleagues in this country has said that that's perhaps one of the most important tasks that we should do at some point in Colombia, and is to do archaeological work regarding Afro-Colombian places of memory, like such as, I don't know, cemeteries for the slavery era, or even palenques, which were called, that's the name of towns that resisted in slavery. So I would like to know if you have had any kind of these experiences in your museums, or, well, in your experience.
We have not at the right, per se. Yeah, I can just say that pretty equivalent.
Go ahead.
My experience with that work has actually been limited to my tenure with the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History. And in that context, that work had to do with indigenous experience. And so rather than African descended folks.
Among my colleagues, there actually, individual curators may do that kind of work because some of those things are part of our exhibits and collection. One of the things we have been involved in the earliest stages is we've got the Slave Rex project. We are partnering with a university and have done some work in South Africa. We're working with the Clotilda in Alabama. And once again, then we're also bringing in young people and training them to have the kind of skills, to scuba dive and do that kind of work. So, we do some of that. I think people would love us to do more. We just don't have the bandwidth after all, but it's important. It's important work for scholarship and documenting and trying to locate artifacts of a history that people didn't value for the longest time or save and preserve. So it's a particular challenge when you're doing African American history.
One thing I'm going to jump back in to say just really quickly has not to do with my professional experience so much. I was in Costa Rica in February of 2020 with the Slave Rex Project folks, because a dear friend of mine is doing that into the depths work. And one of the things that I think is maybe really relevant and important to come up from that is the degree to which the Smithsonian is a convener rather than the driver and, institution that is owning sort of all of this work, right? That people have been engaged in this work globally, actually, in sometimes really grassroots, I want to say small, but that implies that they're not important, but ways globally over a long period of time. And that is a really important, and I think, critical way that the institution has been functioning, to be a convener, to be a hub, to be a resource for all of these disparate organizations that are working in Senegal, in South Africa, in the Caribbean, and all, and say, like, this is how we can share these resources and how we can put you in communication with one another. I think there's a question in the chat about, that put you in conversation with one another and help to amplify your work, without necessarily taking that on as our primary work.
I think that is embedded in the fabric of even all the examples, and thank you for bringing things up that I forget to bring up, but it's basically what we want to do as part of our service to the field, and helping and assisting and getting people to own it, but also giving them the skills to do it correctly, whether it's how to preserve a collection, how to do archaeological research, how to excavate a home and move it somewhere else so it's preserved. I mean, that's that's our commitment. We're a hub, we're a facilitator, we do our own stuff, but we also bring people together, even disparate people together. So it's also a builder of larger communities, you know, as you say, you know, not just African American communities, but people who are doing and have similar interests. So the potential is huge, the charge is large, but that's how you make a real difference and let it spread and proliferate.
Yeah, most definitely. So I believe that we have some questions in the chat, and I'm not sure if someone from my team is going to read them.
How much more time do we have, Julian?
I think we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
I believe. Oh no, we don't have any more time.
That's what I thought I would ask you about. That.
Yeah, so no, I think we have to end this very interesting chat that we had today in this panel. And I would like to thank you all, you guys, because it was an honor to have you here talking about Black history and talking about your museums and your initiatives in order to have some inspiration for this challenging project that we're doing in Colombia. And of course, we are most invited to follow and see all the evolution of this project that we're doing right now. And yeah, I would like to thank all the attendees of this panel. They came, I can see some friends even from the National Museum, from other museums that they took some time from their jobs to be here. And I'd like to thank Felipe. I forgot the name. Yeah, Felipe, the interpreter that tried to translate my Latin American English and of course your American English. And I'd like to thank the US Embassy in Bogota and the Friends of the National Museum of Colombia and the Ministry of Culture as well for supporting all this event. And I hope to see you guys. I've been to the African American Museum, but I haven't had the honor to be in Atlanta or Detroit. It's gonna be my next project to go there and see your museums. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Hey.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.